Now, many people might put this dungeon in their top 5, but it's a little lower on my list. It's very, very popular, but I believe that a lot of people like the Stone Tower Temple due to nostalgia, not because the temple's actually that great. It has fantastic music, probably some of the best music in the game. It's very novel, and it's absolutely gorgeous to look at. There's a lot of cool little stuff there, like the giant statue of Majora's Mask, or all of the little icons. I'm not really quite sure what they're of. Some people say that they're phalluses that are throughout the dungeon. Very, very cool. But despite all that, the dungeon itself isn't actually very fun. The enemies are annoying, especially the black bows in the mirror room, and all the real bomb juice scurrying about. The mini-boss, the Garo Master, was great, but Gannons is a little too difficult for my liking. Twin Mold is incredibly anticlimactic, and you have to fight Wizrobe again for the 4th time in the game. It upset me very much when I first went through there. Now, even though, again, I have to complain about some of the platforming and the enemies and mini-bosses and boss in the dungeon, the Stone Tower Temple is still a really cool place. And it was, of course, fantastic when you get the light arrows for the first time in a dungeon that didn't have a final boss, by the way. And you're able to flip the temple for the first time. That is pretty sweet. And the synthesizer-heavy music for the flipped dungeon really makes it for me. And that's why, even though it's at the bottom of this list, it's still my 15th favorite dungeon out of the 46 dungeons and mini-dungeons in the 3D Zelda. Next up is Gannons Tower from Wind Waker. Now, Gannons Tower is long, and it's probably not the best looker as far as dungeons go, but it's still pretty darn cool. It has enough variety to keep things interesting, while also providing some fun challenges like the labyrinth, or some tricky platforming you have to do earlier in the dungeon. Now, Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask had throwbacks to the previous dungeons, but Gannons Tower, I feel, executes that the best, with the player even having to fight the defeated bosses all over again, which, by the way, very handy for completing the Nintendo Gallery. I also enjoyed how the music changes depending on which area you are in. It matches the theme of the previous dungeons when you're in the temple-themed rooms. Then there's a really cool marimba, almost electronic song once you're in the labyrinth. It's really neat. And of course, Gannons Tower had an excellent final boss fight, a great way to end Wind Waker, and probably one of my favorite final dungeons in the 3D Zelda games. At number 13 is the only mini-dungeon on the list, and my favorite dungeon-type area from Majora's Mask, the Angel Passel of Ikana, or just Ikana Castle for short. It's a really, really cool level, with incredible music, great platforming, and a cool design. I like how you can feel the theme of the mini-dungeon throughout the level, with all the ancient, almost Inca-like architecture, and the undead enemies throughout the dungeon, climaxing with it goes to Ikana and its lackeys at the end. It's just really, really cool. And it's actually surprising how it was the closest we got to a shadow-themed dungeon in the dark game Majora's Mask. I liked how the dungeon item of Ikana Castle was the Elegy of Emptiness, a song. That was pretty different. And it's great that the Elegy of Emptiness itself is a cool song. It was a lot of fun to watch the Re-Dead dance, and also to watch them squirm whenever you pass under a bit of light with your mirror shield. And it was neat how they danced differently in each room. It almost makes you wonder a bit about the lore in the game. Were the Re-Dead entertainers? Were they servants to the king? You never really find out, but it's one of those cool little Nintendo touches. A bit of a showing, not telling. Now, the problem with Ikana Castle is that even though it goes through Ikana and his lackeys were cool, the fight against them was really stressful for me, and it's kind of a pain, especially when you're fighting the king himself and he detaches his head and you don't know what on earth is you to get to keep the head from grabbing onto you. Pretty stressful. I don't even like, even though it's cool how you have to shoot a fire arrow at the curtains to be even able to hurt these guys, it's really stressful turning away from the enemies walking right up to me just so I can try to hope to shoot and hit one of those curtains. It's stressful, but overall, it's a really great dungeon and my favorite mini dungeon. Skykeep gets its high rating from its great concept of turning the dungeon into one giant puzzle. Even though I don't even like slider puzzles. That's how great it was and how novel it was for the series. Now, most of the dungeon just resembles previous dungeons, but I appreciate how the main entrance room looks and how it has a very similar look to the Tower of the Gods from the Wind Waker. I thought that was a nice touch and another example of Nintendo making connections without using words. Each room in Skykeep summarizes this dungeon quite nicely, and Skykeep does a great job at being one of the best final dungeons Nintendo has designed. It really is a good dungeon. Its lack of an item was a shame, though. I would say, though, that that was partially made up for by the player finally being able to lay hands on the Triforce of Power without Ganon being anywhere nearby. That was pretty cool. Now, some people say that Skykeep doesn't have a boss, but I would argue Girahim and Demise were the boss of Skykeep. Using that argument, Skykeep had a great boss duo, but I did have to dock it points for there even needing to be a debate about that in the first place. Overall, my favorite final dungeon, and I just wish we could hear that amazing tune throughout the entire area instead of just one room. It gives me chills. A good one. The Wind Temple won me over right away with its disconcerting music. I love how the soothing woodwinds lead into a rather menacing guitar and low string section. The dungeon may not be the best looking of Wind Waker's dungeons, but it has a cool atmosphere, especially in the central room with a giant fan. It was great seeing a wind dungeon finally in a 3D Zelda game, especially after the Wind Temple from Ocarina of Time was cut. The Wind Temple gets a high number of points for the hookshot, which seems to get more and more fun with every game it appears in. I love the sounds it makes in Wind Waker when you fire it at targets, and I love the sort of pulling sensation you get when it latches onto something and tugs you in. The Wind Temple also gets a lot of points for having my favorite boss and mini-boss in the game. Red Wizrobe keeps me on the edge of my seat and really symbolizes Wind Waker's return to the Zelda series' more combat-focused roots. And even though Majora was a little easy, the fight, its scale, and its music are all still very breathtaking. What bogs the Wind Temple down is its enemies, which are far too annoying, especially the Peahats. Also, using Makar was great, but he was a bit too fragile for my tastes and wasn't quite as useful as Medley was. It also wasn't that fun having to save him all the time from those wall masters. Our first dungeon from Twilight Princess on this list is the Temple of Time. I much prefer to call it the Light Temple though, because that's really what it is, the light dungeon that we never got to explore in Ocarina of Time because Rauru didn't need saving. It is for that reason that right off the bat I think it is a very cool dungeon. The best thing in the Temple of Time is its atmosphere. Its glittering windows, clean hallways, and tiptoeing spiders that are visible from afar made the dungeon a very cool experience. Its music was excellent too, some of my favorite in the game. The rod that you find in the temple was cool, and it made for some very fun gameplay in the dungeon. However, I had to dock at some points because the rod is largely useless for the rest of the game. The dungeon also gets a high 5 for a challenging mini-boss and a cool throwback to Gama bosses of old. It's a shame though that Armugama is no tougher than any other boss in the game. With the Light Temple having been cut from Ocarina of Time, it was a real pleasure that Nintendo allowed us to finally explore its walls in Twilight Princess. And so we arrive at another stellar dungeon from Skyward Sword. The Sandship gets points right off the bat for being the most unexpected dungeon in the game and the first dungeon in a Zelda game to take place on a boat. That was pretty snazzy. Even though the sand ship reused the time shift stone concept from the Lanayru mining facility, it still felt fresh. Switching back and forth between the pristine dungeon of the past and the dusty old dungeon of the present was both fun and cool, especially after spending the first half of the dungeon entirely in the present. It was very nice to finally get a hold of the bow in this dungeon. However, even though the bow was a blast to use and very welcome, I docked it a bit because the bow wound up being way too overpowered and ruined the novel Zelda challenge of figuring out how to beat distant enemies from afar. Both the boss and the mini-boss of the dungeon were great, even though Tantalus looked like something out of Monsters Incorporated. However, it would have been even cooler to see the mini-boss captain also make an appearance in the past. After all, he should still be around at that point in time. In fact, I was disappointed not to find him. My favorite thing about the dungeon, though, was the music. Skyward Sword had some great tunes, and 2 of them were aboard the sand ship. I particularly liked how similar some of the music outside was to Tangerine Dream's sort of style. Overall, the sand ship was great and a very tough dungeon to top. 8 incredible dungeons managed to do so, though, so let's move on. Finishing up the first 8 of my top 15 3D Zelda dungeons is one that many put in their top 5. The Spirit Temple was awesome. I still get chills every time the music starts playing. Even though the Spirit Temple takes place late in the game after either the Water Temple or the Shadow Temple, depending on how you play the game, it still feels familiar thanks to Nintendo showing that chilling scene with Nabooru right when you turn on the game if you don't press start. When you arrive in the Spirit Temple, you feel accomplished because of that. The mysterious scene suddenly becomes less of a mystery as that imposing music begins playing and you realize how far you've come. There were only 2 things I didn't really like about the Spirit Temple. Even though it was neat doing the dungeon as both a child and an adult, the Spirit Temple still sticks out as one of the most cookie-cutter dungeons in Ocarina of Time. When the game came out, it was mind-blowing. Later games having dungeons that pull time travel off better, such as the Mermaid's Cave in Oracle of Ages, or the 2 desert dungeons in Skyward Sword, the novelty of time travel is worn thin, and the Spirit Temple doesn't do very much else to set itself apart other than its few light puzzles. Also, it's a bit nitpicky, but it was a shame a Gibdo mummy didn't appear in the dungeon until the Master Quest. The best part about the dungeon is by far its boss. Puzzles are great, the iron knuckles are swell, but when I replay Ocarina of Time, there's one thing on my mind as soon as I set foot into the dungeon as an adult: Twin Rova. Twin Rova is one of the best bosses in Zelda history and a great way to end Ocarina of Time's temple spree. It is a fight that no Zelda fan should miss. Now with that, we will move on to the top 7 3D Zelda dungeons in the next video. I've split them out so that you have a bit of a break if you have something else to do. But I figured we should end on a high note with the Spirit Temple, which is only my 8th favorite dungeon in the 3D Zelda games, but I'm sure is the top or 2nd highest favorite dungeon for a lot of people. So I figured that was a good place to end. See you next time, and thanks for watching.